So this one's been on my to-watch list for ages. Not least because, for once, my mom watched a new release before me, and he apparently loved it. Anyway, I finally watched The Sea Beast, and I loved it, so I'm going to talk about it. Even though I am extremely late to the party. The Sea Beast is a great animated movie, and if you for some reason haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. It's beautifully animated, not as stylized as some other recent titles, but it has a flavor all its own that marks it as its own thing. It feels a little counterproductive to say, but one of the things I use to decide if I like the style of a 3D animated movie is if I could see it working as a 2D animated movie, specifically in the character design department. Call it personal preference, if you like, but I've been scarred by Disney's line of 3D clones, so I think I'll stick to my guns on this one. The music and sound design are also absolute standouts. I've always been a sucker for Celtic folk, and this movie is absolutely dripping with it. But it also knows when to cut back. There are two scenes in particular where the sound almost cuts out entirely to let the audience hang in eerie silence. The first is early in the movie when the crew of the Inevitable have downed a sea beast known as a brickleback, and the captain goes down to saw off its horn as proof of the kill. It is an undeniably eerie moment, as almost all sound cuts out and we're left with this visual of this massive animal sinking slowly towards the sea floor. But there's also something almost mournful about it. And then the brickleback tries to drag the captain down with it, and it turns just flat out unsettling as we get to process in time with him that he's about to drown. He doesn't, of course, but that's neither here nor there. The second is one of the first true character moments of the titular sea beast, the Red Bluster, or just Red as she's later nicknamed by Maisie. It's when Maisie and Jacob have fallen into the water following the near sinking of the Inevitable, and we get this almost completely silent shot of Red staring up at them, and then slowly sinking back into the darkness, leaving them unharmed. There are other moments I could name where I appreciate the sound design of this movie, but those two stand out particularly clearly, so I'll leave it there. Good animation and sound will only do so much, though, if the story doesn't hold up. So, does the story hold up? Yes. Yes, it does. In short, it's a story about legacy and propaganda and grappling with the fact that what you've been taught is right is, in actuality, wrong. It follows Maisie Brumble, a young orphan girl whose parents were hunters aboard a ship called the Monarch, which sunk on a hunt. She lives in a children's home where the orphan kids of hunters are cared for. Hunting is such a famously dangerous profession that the monarchy has specifically set up an orphanage for the children that will inevitably lose their parents to it. Maisie has, of course, grown up on tales of hunters and their exploits, and specifically the motto, "Live a great life, die a great death." She's been told that her parents died this great death, that they died heroes. So, naturally, she wants to join a hunting crew. But not just any ship will do, no, she wants to join the Inevitable under Captain Augustus Crow III. In pursuit of this, she's apparently tried to run away several times, to the point where her breakouts are so routine that her roommates just know the drill immediately. The movie, of course, starts on her last and actually successful attempt. She makes it to the city just in time for the Inevitable to draw into port, and she meets our other main character, Jacob Holland. Jacob is a hunter aboard the Inevitable and the adopted son of Captain Crow. When he was a child, a sea beast wrecked the ship he and presumably his parents were on. He survived by clinging to a bit of driftwood until the Inevitable happened across him and the captain took him in. He was raised, from then on, aboard that hunting ship, and when Maisie informs him of her plans to join the crew, he immediately shoots her down, arguing that a hunting ship is no place for a child. She, of course, argues back that he joined the crew when he was her age. I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark here, and say that's exactly why he's so against it. Either way, he sends her away in a carriage taxi back in the direction of the orphanage and believes that's the last he'll see of her. He's wrong. But before he realizes that, he, Crow, and Crow's first mate, Sarah Sharp, have a stop to make at the palace. They're welcomed with some faint praise before the Queen stands up and demands to know why the Red Bluster's horn isn't among the ones brought in. Because they have heard that the Inevitable had the Red Bluster in their sights, but abandoned it because they spotted another hunting ship in distress. The Crown is not pleased about this, and they've decided they're going to let their navy take over hunting sea beasts. In the interest of this, they've commissioned a massive galleon named the Imperator to be captained by Admiral Hornigold. Captain Crow, of course, immediately spots all of the reasons this ship will be torn to pieces the instant it sets sail, and he's none too gentle in pointing them out, leading to a shouting match and almost getting himself arrested, until Jacob steps up and offers the idea of a contest. If the Imperator kills the Red Bluster first, then alright. The days of the hunters are over. If the Inevitable kills her first, then the Crown has to admit they were wrong and leave the system as it is. The King and Queen agree to this because either way the greatest threat to their ships is dealt with, and it's off to the races. When the Inevitable is already pretty far out to sea, the crew discovers that Maisie stowed away. Jacob immediately wants to drop her off at the nearest port, but Captain Crow says he sees a spark in her, and allows her to stay. He tells Sarah to look after her, and the two have a slightly hilarious interaction in Sarah's cabin, where Maisie is just fangirling and Sarah tries to be intimidating, which results in pure awe instead. Not the reaction she was probably going for. Either way, this means Maisie is on board when the Inevitable encounters Red, and she's in a position to listen when Jacob says they have to cut the lines, or Red will drag them to the bottom of the sea whether she's living or dead. She does so despite Crow threatening her, and Red gets away. What follows is a scene where Crow demands Jacob bring him Maisie, and Jacob resists, essentially begging his father not to murder a child. Of course, things don't get a chance to escalate further, because Red breaches the surface and swallows the boat Maisie and Jacob are on. Because those are her humans now and you do not point a gun at them. They end up on an island inhabited by some sea beasts that are semi-terrestrial, which includes Red, not that that's exactly a surprise given her seal-like flippers and nostrils. While there, Jacob and Maisie learn that these beasts aren't as fearsome as they've been led to believe. Or rather, Maisie learns and drags Jacob, kicking and screaming, into the realization that his entire life has been a lie. It's also here that Maisie decides Red's a girl and nicknames her Red, and finds another significantly smaller creature who she nicknames Blue, because he's blue. As a side note, did Red have to have what is essentially eyeliner so the audience would understand she's a girl? Is that something they had to do? Because I don't think so, frankly. Maisie manages to communicate with Red enough to tell her that they would like a ride back to civilization. A ride during which Maisie alone at first, and then she and Jacob together, remove the lances and harpoons from Red's back and ponder on the lies told in their history, and if there ever even were any dark times. Jacob especially goes through an entire existential crisis because, remember, he's been doing this since he was a literal child. Meanwhile, Crow has let the very last shreds of his chill go flying out the window as the perceived death of his son sends him into a vengeful tailspin. That has him seeking out someone named Gwen Batterby, a merchant who deals in poisons who the hunters revile because they see her methods as dishonorable, and because there's a superstition around doing business with her. That, while you'll see success in the short term, in the long run it will lead to nothing but misery. But Crow doesn't care, because while he may have been a garbage father, he did genuinely care about Jacob in his own way. And in losing Jacob, he's also losing his legacy, the person he wanted to carry on the inevitable after he was gone. All of this leads to the inevitable capturing Red and hauling her back to the capital, where Crow wants to make a show of killing her in front of everyone instead of letting the poison finish working. Sarah warns against this, but I get the distinct feeling he's never really listened to her, so her warning goes unheeded. Either way, this gives Maisie and Jacob a chance to put a stop to things. Blue helps Maisie break out of the cabin she was locked in to try and cut the ropes, while Jacob steps up onto Red to try and talk his father down. Which does not go well, by which I mean Crow immediately draws his sword and tries to actually seriously murder his son, and good God, Jacob is going to need so much therapy about this. A whole final showdown goes down, during which Sarah mutinies and helps free Red, and the entire capital turns on the king and queen after witnessing a tiny child seemingly communicate with the worst of the beasts they've been taught to hate and fear, and give an entire speech about how their history is a lie. Red swims off into the sunset, Jacob and Maisie become family officially, and people don't try to sail out into the sea beast's waters anymore. As I said near the start of this movie has some clear themes around legacy and how propaganda can warp mindsets and make threats real where none existed. The whole reason hunters exist is because of the idea that once upon a time the sea beasts used to come up right to the shore to attack human settlements, but that just isn't true. The sea beasts have no interest in humans, right up until they're floating around on large wooden intrusions in their territory. Naturally, this makes any kind of seafaring trade or travel almost impossible. So, some 100 or so years ago, the monarchy of the time concocted a lie to clear the way for previously impossible trade routes. Along with this lie came the lie of the hunter's great death. Now, I may be death positive in my philosophy, but make no mistake. There is a massive difference between being in general accepting of death as a part of life, and state-sponsored propaganda promoting the idea of dying a violent but heroic death. There are two moments of marvelously paralleled lines from the beginning and end of the movie that illustrate Maisie's growth as a character and the change in her philosophy beautifully. And because I don't think I could describe them better than the movie portrayed them, here they are.
They say no first mate is more loyal
That's
than...
enough.
No first mate more loyal than Sarah Sharp. Live a great life and die a great death. I come from a long line of hunters that died your great death.
Honestly, the second example I gave there nearly bowled me over the first time I watched this movie. The second theme, that of legacy, and more specifically having a complicated relationship with those who've come before you, is also illustrated in Maisie, but arguably even more so in Jacob. It's touched on a bit in Maisie's struggle with what to think of her parents when she learns that the sea beasts aren't as bad as they've been made out to be. But it is painfully clear in the relationship between Jacob and Captain Crow. As I hope I've made clear, Jacob is Captain Crow's adoptive son. But to say Crow was a good father would be a downright lie. Firstly, Jacob grew up on a hunting ship, when the existence of an orphanage for children of deceased hunters strongly implies that that is very much not common practice. This alone would certainly count as reckless endangerment, which would be enough to make me squint at him, but he doesn't stop there. Despite viewing Jacob as his son, and presumably raising him since he pulled him from the water, Jacob is surprised to learn that Crow wants him to inherit the inevitable. Jacob also notably calls Crow Captain, just like everyone else. Not Dad, Augustus, or anything even a little more personal than a professional title. So you can add emotional neglect, not that that surprises me from a man like Crow. There's even a hint of possible physical abuse. Crow is famously a hard ass, to the point where even his crew fear him, and none of them expect him to go easy on Jacob. It's not exactly concrete proof, but when paired with how immediately he went for Jacob's throat when Jacob stepped up to stop him from killing Red, and how, when Crow pulled his pistol on Jacob and Maisie, Jacob had no doubt in his mind for even a second that this man could and would kill a child for losing him his catch, it doesn't exactly paint a rosy picture, is all I'll say. Despite all of that, Jacob still respects and loves Crow, because despite all of that, this man legitimately saved his life when he was a kid, and gave him a family in the Inevitable's crew. And likewise, despite being a horrible parent, I believe Crow genuinely did love Jacob in his own way. I'm not going to pretend it was a healthy way, but I believe he did love him regardless. Given Crow is the third in a line of captains of the Inevitable that started with his grandfather, I genuinely believe there's a cycle of toxic family dynamics at best, abuse at worst, going on here that Jacob breaks in his willingness to hear Maisie out and see and accept where he's been wrong. He's able to take Maisie's words,
"Maybe you can be a hero and still be wrong,"
to heart. He is able to internalize them and use them to help him course correct. That's not something Crow can do, and he loses everything because of it. And lastly, because this is my channel, so you knew this was coming, I want to briefly talk about how disability is handled in this movie. Because there are a handful of disabled characters knocking about. Naturally, with a profession like hunting, the entire crew of the Inevitable have a whole bunch of battle scars, some more severe than others. The captain and first mate are both disabled in different ways. Captain Crow is blind in one eye, having lost it in a battle with Red at some point in his youth, presumably. It's one of the reasons he cites in his specific fixation on taking her down. Later, it's one of the reasons he cites to completely shoot down all of Jacob's arguments about how the sea beasts might not be as bad as they've been led to believe. Now, if his revenge quest against Red was entirely based on just his eye, I would have a problem with it. It would come off as one note and stale. But there are so many other reasons. The propaganda he's been mired in his whole life, the presumed death of his son for a while, and his desperation to cling to the only way of life he's ever known, just to name a few, that throwing "she took my eye" on the pile is more like the cherry on top of a shit sundae than the trope of an embittered disabled person being driven entirely by their anger about the fact that they're disabled. Sarah Sharp, his first mate, is down a leg, sporting the classic peg leg as her prosthetic. Unlike her captain, she's much more blasé about her disability. In fact, she never says a word about it. She just exists with it, at peace with it, and herself. The animators also bothered to actually animate a semi-realistic walk cycle for her. I realize this is an incredibly low bar, but it's something I noticed and appreciated, so it didn't feel right to leave it unmentioned. Sarah is an undisputed badass, and she starts the movie as unquestioningly loyal to Captain Crow, to the point where she doesn't voice opposition to his initial gut reaction to abandon Jim Nickelbones and his crew to the Brickleback. It's Jacob that convinces him to change course. Because the movie isn't about her, we don't get to see a lot of her journey in beginning to question his judgment, eventually leading up to full-on mutiny, but what we do see is just enough to paint a very compelling picture of her character. She doesn't know who she is without the inevitable and her crew, but her captain's made enough questionable decisions, and she's seen enough odd things that the cutting disappointment of a child who once looked up to her is enough to tip the scales in the end. It's partially her existence, as well as the existence of disabled background characters, that also serves to make Crow's "the red bluster took my eye" sound like it's less about the fact that he's disabled now, and more the fact that Red injured him at all, and he wants his pound of flesh for it. Disability just is in this movie, and while yes, we don't see maybe any at all among the non-hunter population, at least they've been realistic in the kind of dangers a profession like this would entail. In short, I liked this movie, though I'm a little confused as to what the rumored sequel is going to be about. I'd like to imagine it'd be about societal conflict and the massive political and economic implications of such a massive change to everyone's way of life, but given it's a kids' movie, I don't think that's going to be the case. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Thanks for watching this video. If you liked it, consider liking it and maybe subscribing. I will be back here Thursday after next. Bye!